It was a typical Thursday evening, the kind Sarah had come to cherish after a long week of work. Her feet ached, the relentless hours at the office had drained her energy, and all she wanted now was to unwind. The moment she unlocked the door and stepped inside her apartment, the familiar scent of her favorite candles greeted her, a small comfort in the midst of a long, tiring day. She kicked off her shoes and set down her purse, sighing as she ran a hand through her disheveled hair. But something was different tonight. There was a sound, laughter. Not the kind that came from the television or the soft hum of music she sometimes played to relax. No, this laughter was real, spontaneous, and it echoed through the apartment. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her body frozen at the threshold of the living room. The voice she heard wasn't hers, nor was it the voice of her roommate Emily, who sometimes stayed over. No, this was unmistakably the laugh of Mark, the man she had been in a committed relationship with for the past 2 years. A mix of curiosity and unease crept up her spine. Was Mark entertaining a friend? Maybe someone from work? But as Sarah slowly stepped toward the living room, she felt a pang of discomfort growing in the pit of her stomach. It was odd for him to have company over without telling her first, especially on a quiet Thursday night when they usually had dinner together. She moved closer, her heart beginning to beat faster as the laughter grew louder. There were voices, but Sarah couldn't make out the words yet. The last few steps felt like they took an eternity as she found herself standing at the doorway of the living room. The sight before her made her blood run cold. Mark was sitting on the couch, his body angled toward a woman Sarah had never seen before. The woman's long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and she was laughing as she leaned in, seemingly sharing a private joke with Mark. Her hand rested casually on Mark's knee, her fingers lightly brushing against his skin. Sarah could see the chemistry between them, the way Mark's smile widened with each laugh the woman let out. It was the kind of look he usually reserved for Sarah, playful, affectionate, and intimate. For a long moment, Sarah stood there, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She felt as though the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Mark's voice cut through her thoughts. "Sarah?" he said, his tone hesitant, almost guilty. Sarah felt a mix of emotions flood her: shock, confusion, and a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal. She couldn't move at first, paralyzed by the surreal scene before her. Was this really happening? She had trusted Mark. She had always thought their relationship was solid. They had made plans for the future together, shared hopes, dreams, and even talked about buying a house. The idea that he could be here, laughing and so at ease with another woman in their shared space, was almost more than Sarah could bear. For a second, Mark seemed to realize the severity of the situation. He jumped up from the couch, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and guilt. I didn't think you'd be home so soon," he stammered, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "This isn't what it looks like, Sarah." But Sarah didn't want to hear his excuses. She wasn't interested in hearing what he thought he could say to explain away this moment. She had seen enough. The woman on the couch, who was now awkwardly shifting in her seat, had no shame in the way she lingered near Mark, and that was all the confirmation Sarah needed. The laughter, the casual touches, the shared intimacy, it was all there. A stark contrast to the life Sarah had thought they shared. Without uttering a word, Sarah turned around and walked out of the living room. She heard Mark's voice calling her name, but it was distant, fading as she made her way toward the front door. Each step she took felt heavier than the last. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, couldn't stand the idea of hearing anything more from him right now. The door clicked shut behind her, and Sarah found herself standing in the hallway, outside their apartment, her breath shallow and uneven. The coolness of the evening air didn't do much to calm the fire that was building inside her. Her heart was pounding in her chest as her emotions began to spill over. She had been hurt before, but never like this. Never by someone she loved, someone she thought would never betray her. The tears were threatening to spill, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. She had to get away, to find some air to clear her mind before she allowed herself to break down. Sarah didn't know where. She was walking, only that she needed to escape. The streets of the city, dimly lit and eerily quiet at this hour, were her only companions as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. There was no going back from this. She had seen the truth, and the truth was painful. The chill of the evening air hit Sarah as she stepped outside, the world around her feeling surreal, as if she were caught in a dream she couldn't wake from. Her heart was heavy, a weight she had never carried before. The image of Mark on the couch, so carefree with another woman, replayed in her mind over and over again. Every moment, every laugh they shared, seemed to taunt her, reminding her of the trust she had placed in him. She couldn't shake the sting of that betrayal. Sarah didn't know where she was going, her legs carrying her aimlessly down the streets of their neighborhood. She was conscious of the fact that she didn't have her phone with her, nor any other belongings, but it didn't matter. Right now, nothing mattered except the turmoil inside her. She was numb, but also, in a strange way, she felt like she was about to implode. As she walked, the crisp air bit at her skin, but the discomfort was somehow soothing, grounding her in the moment. She needed this time to think, to clear her head. Every now and then, a thought would pierce the fog in her mind. Mark, with that woman, the way they were so comfortable with each other. How long had this been going on? Was it a one-time thing? Or had he been hiding this from her for weeks, maybe months? The longer she walked, the more questions surfaced, each one heavier than the last. She didn't have the answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't go back to that apartment, not right now. She needed space. She needed time. Her mind raced back to the last few months. Had there been signs? Had she missed something? She thought about the little things, the subtle changes in Mark's behavior. There had been moments when he'd been distant, distracted, but she had chalked it up to work stress or fatigue. She never imagined it could be something like this. The thought that she had been blind to the truth made her stomach twist in regret. Why hadn't she seen it coming? How could she have been so naive? Eventually, her feet carried her to a small park she often visited to unwind. It was a peaceful place, a temporary escape from the chaos of her daily life. She sat down on a bench under a large oak tree, its branches bare in the early autumn chill. The park was quiet, save for the distant sounds of city traffic. The silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, almost suffocating. Her hands trembled as she pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the images of Mark and that woman. The pain in her chest was raw, overwhelming. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and most of all, lost. She had always imagined a future with Mark, buying a house, building a life together. But now that future seemed like a distant dream, one that was slipping through her fingers. Her phone buzzed in her bag, startling her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before pulling it out, seeing Mark's name on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat. He was already trying to contact her. She stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to shut him out completely. But another part of her, the part that still cared, wondered what he would say. "Sarah, please, I didn't mean for this to happen. Can we talk?" The message was short, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. He was, asking for forgiveness, for a chance to explain. She had no doubt that he would try to justify his actions, spin some story about how it had all been a mistake or a misunderstanding. But Sarah knew deep down that nothing he said would erase what she had seen. The trust between them had been shattered, and there was no going back from that. She exhaled sharply, typing out a response before she could overthink it. "There's nothing to talk about, Mark. I saw what I needed to see." She hit send, her thumb shaking slightly. It felt final, like closing a door that could never be opened again. She stared at the message for a moment, then turned off her phone. The buzzing, the constant reminders of his existence, felt like a constant weight pressing down on her, reminding her of the pain she was still processing. The sound of her phone turning off felt like a small victory in the silence that had settled around her. She needed this silence, needed the space to breathe without the constant pressure of unanswered questions, of the guilt and shame that Mark was no doubt feeling. As she sat there, alone in the park, Sarah realized she didn't have all the answers, yet. She didn't know what the future held, and she wasn't sure what the next steps would be. But one thing was clear. She had to find herself again. She couldn't keep living in a world built on lies and half-truths. She wasn't sure when she would go back to their apartment or what she would say when she did, but for now, the only thing that mattered was her own peace. It was time to stop fighting for a relationship that wasn't fighting for her. It was time to focus on healing, on finding her own strength in the midst of this betrayal. The silence wasn't just the world around her. It was the space she needed to heal. Sarah sat on the bench in the park for what felt like hours, the weight of the evening pressing heavily on her shoulders. The world around her seemed distant, almost as though she were watching it from behind a glass. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, but none of it reached her. Her thoughts were trapped in a loop, circling around the same painful images. Mark with the other woman, laughing, sharing a connection that had once been hers alone. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she stared out at the darkening sky. Her mind kept racing, asking questions she couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? Was it just tonight? Or had there been others before her? She remembered how Mark had seemed off in the last few weeks. Distracted, distant and less affectionate. But she had brushed it off, telling herself it was just stress from work or personal issues. She never imagined it could be something like this. She had never imagined that her entire world would be shattered by a single moment. The more she thought about it, the more the anger bubbled up inside her. Anger at Mark for betraying her, yes, but also at herself for not seeing the signs, for trusting someone who clearly didn't value her the way she deserved. It was an overwhelming feeling, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a clarity, a determination rising within her. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, seeing Mark's name once more. Another message. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Please just let me explain. I never wanted to hurt you." She felt a wave of emotion rise up. Frustration, sadness, and yes, some part of her still cared for him. But the truth was staring her in the face. There was nothing left to explain. The trust they had built together had crumbled, and no amount of words could rebuild it. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment as she fought the urge to respond. Should she answer him? Should she let him talk? But deep down, Sarah knew the answer. There was no point in dragging this out. There was no going back to the way things were, no matter how much Mark wanted to pretend that everything could be fixed with a conversation. She had seen enough. The reality of the situation was undeniable, and the harsh truth was that she couldn't stay in a relationship that wasn't built on mutual respect and trust. With a deep breath, Sarah typed out her response. "There's nothing left to say, Mark. I saw everything I needed to see. I don't want this anymore." She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. The words felt heavy, final, but at the same time there was a sense of relief. She had made her choice. She had drawn a line in the sand and was ready to move on, even if it terrified her. As soon as the message was sent, she switched off her phone. For the first time in what felt like hours, the noise in her mind quieted. It was as though she had given herself permission to let go. She didn't have to keep holding on to something that was broken beyond repair. She didn't have to keep fighting for a relationship that had already ended in all but name. But even with the relief of making a decision, there was still a part of Sarah that felt raw and vulnerable. The pain of what had happened wasn't something that would go away overnight. Her relationship with Mark had been a significant part of her life, and as much as she tried to move forward, it hurt to think that everything they had shared had been built on a foundation of lies. She could feel the sting in her chest, and it was hard not to wonder if she would ever fully heal from this betrayal. She stood up from the bench, her legs shaky, and started walking. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay in the park any longer. The stillness of the night, the absence of people, made everything feel too heavy. The quiet was deafening, and Sarah felt the need to escape from the constant reminder of her broken heart. As she walked down the empty streets, her mind began to drift to her next steps. She couldn't go back to the apartment. Not yet. The thought of seeing Mark again, of hearing his excuses and pleas, made her stomach churn. She didn't want to be near him. Not now. She needed space. The idea of leaving the apartment, of starting fresh somewhere new, took root in her mind. She didn't need to make any rash decisions, but it was clear to her that staying where everything reminded her of Mark wasn't the answer. She needed to reclaim her life, her space, and her peace of mind. She could no longer live in the shadow of the relationship she had thought was everything. It was time to start over. Sarah found herself walking toward her best friend Emily's apartment, not even realizing where her feet had taken her until she arrived at the door. Emily would understand. She always did. Sarah needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't judge her for the decision she'd just made, someone who would help her process the overwhelming emotions of betrayal, loss, and fear of the future. She rang the doorbell, and as the door swung open, Emily's concerned expression softened into one of understanding. Without a word, Emily wrapped her arms around Sarah, pulling her into a hug. For a moment, Sarah let herself break down, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time since everything fell apart, she felt like she was no longer alone in her pain. And that, in itself, was a small victory. Sarah wasn't sure how long she had been walking when she finally found herself standing outside her apartment again. The lights in the living room were on, casting a soft glow through the windows, and she could see the silhouette of Mark moving around inside. His presence, once a source of comfort, now felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The pain of what she had seen earlier was still fresh, gnawing at her from within. Her mind raced as she stood there, her breath shallow in the cool evening air. She had left. She had sent the message, and for a brief moment, there had been a sense of relief. But now, standing in front of the door, Sarah wasn't sure what she wanted. Did she want to yell at him? Did she want to hear his explanations, or was she just searching for closure? She couldn't decide. Her emotions were too tangled. Anger, betrayal, sadness, and confusion swirling together in a storm that refused to settle. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The sound of the hinges creaked in the silence, and Mark's head snapped toward the sound. His face immediately softened when he saw her, but there was a sense of tension in his posture. He stood up from the couch, his hands instinctively reaching for her, though he didn't touch her. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He took a step toward her, his eyes pleading, searching her face for a sign of forgiveness, or perhaps just understanding. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know what to say. The words she had typed earlier still echoed in her mind. "I don't want this anymore." But standing here, seeing the man she once loved, her emotions were still raw. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, but her eyes welled up with tears. She blinked them away, trying to hold on to the fragile strength she had built in the past few hours. Mark took another step toward her, his voice trembling as he spoke again. "I never meant for this to happen. I should have told you earlier. I should have never let it get this far, but please let me explain, just give me a chance." The words were familiar, the same excuses Sarah had heard from people before. Broken promises, miscommunication, and the promise of change. They all sounded empty now. "Explain what, Mark?" Sarah's voice was hoarse, but there was a fierce determination in her tone. She crossed her arms over her chest, as if trying to protect herself from what was coming. "Explain how you brought another woman into our home while I was out, laughing and sharing moments that should have been ours? Explain how you've been, lying to me, hiding this from me for who knows how long?" The anger that had been simmering inside her erupted, and her words came out sharp and unrestrained. "I don't need your explanations, Mark. I don't need to hear how it happened or how sorry you are. The truth is, you've already shown me who you really are, and I'm done." Mark's face fell, his shoulders slumping with the weight of her words. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but Sarah shook her head, cutting him off. "No," she said firmly. "Don't. Please. I don't want to hear it anymore." Mark took a deep breath, and for the first time, Sarah saw something different in his eyes. Regret, yes, but also an understanding that this was beyond repair. He had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I never meant to hurt you. You're everything to me. I don't know how I let this happen, but I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that. I don't want to lose you." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of sorrow. Sarah's heart ached at the sight of him standing there, broken, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. The damage had been done. The trust that had once bound them together had been shattered, and no apology could mend it now. "You already lost me, Mark," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "You lost me the moment you made the choice to disrespect me, to bring someone else into our lives without a second thought. I can't be with someone who doesn't value me enough to be honest. Not anymore." Mark's face twisted with pain, but Sarah could see that he was finally accepting what was happening. This was the end. There was no grand reconciliation, no emotional plea that would change her mind. She had made her decision, and despite the ache in her chest, she knew it was the right one. "You need to leave," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You need to go. I can't keep doing this. It's over." For a moment, Mark just stood there looking at her as if hoping she would change her mind. But there was no flicker of doubt in Sarah. This was the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was the only way forward. Slowly, Mark nodded, his eyes downcast. He didn't fight her, didn't argue. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing for a moment before stepping out into the hallway. As the door closed behind him, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her knees felt weak, and she leaned against the door for support, tears finally spilling down her face. But this time, they weren't tears of defeat or regret. They were tears of release, tears of letting go. She had taken control of her life again. She had made the right choice, no matter how difficult it was. She would heal. She would move on. And she would never allow herself to be in a situation where she wasn't valued or respected. The pain would fade, but the strength she had found in herself would stay. The moment the door clicked shut behind Mark, the apartment fell into an eerie silence, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the room just moments before. Sarah stood there for a while, still leaning against the door, her body trembling from the emotional roller coaster of the past few minutes. The finality of it all weighed heavily on her chest. She had done it. She had made the decision to let go, to walk away from the relationship she had once believed in so fiercely. But it wasn't easy, not by any means. Her mind raced, trying to process the moment. "Did I do the right thing?" she thought to herself. "What if I've made a mistake?" The doubts crept in, as they always did after a significant change. It was easy to question oneself when emotions were running high. But Sarah knew deep down that there was no turning back. There was no room for doubt. Mark had betrayed her trust, and while the decision to leave him had been agonizing, it was the only thing left for her to do. She walked slowly into the living room, her footsteps heavy as she surveyed the space that had once been a sanctuary, a place filled with memories they had shared. The couch where they had watched movies together, the kitchen table where they'd eaten countless meals, the shelves with photographs of trips they had taken. It all felt so foreign now, as though everything in this apartment had changed in the blink of an eye. The life she had built here was no longer hers. She couldn't stay in this place, not with the ghost of Mark haunting every corner. A wave of sadness washed over her. She felt an overwhelming loss, not just of the relationship, but of the future she had imagined. She had envisioned growing old with Mark, creating more memories, sharing more laughter, and building a life together. But now, all of that had crumbled in one evening. The life she thought she knew was gone. It felt like she was grieving a death, but a death that wasn't caused by time or fate. No, this was a death of trust, of love, of a dream that had been shattered by betrayal. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to feel the weight of the loss. She allowed herself to mourn the future that would never come to be. The tears came then, soft at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. She cried for the woman she had been before Mark, the one who had trusted so completely, the one who had believed in love with all her heart. She cried for the betrayal, for the years she had invested in a relationship that had never been as solid as she had thought. But most of all, she cried for herself, the person she had lost in the midst of it all. But then, as the tears slowed and the weight of grief began to lift, something else emerged from within her. A quiet strength, a realization that she wasn't broken, that she hadn't lost everything. She hadn't lost herself. And that was something Mark could never take from her. Sarah wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, straightening up. It was time. Time to move forward. Time to reclaim her life. She didn't need Mark, didn't need to stay in a place that reminded her of everything she had been through. There was no sense in lingering in a space that had been tainted by betrayal. She turned toward the window, gazing out at the city below. The streets were bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the world outside continuing on as if nothing had changed. But Sarah knew better. Her world had shifted. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this apartment just a few hours ago. She had faced the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had come out on the other side stronger. She walked to her phone, still sitting on the kitchen counter where she had left it earlier. It buzzed with new notifications, Mark's name flashing across the screen. She ignored them, her finger swiping past the messages, not even pausing to read them. It didn't matter what he had to say anymore. She didn't need his words to make sense of what had happened. She had already made her choice. She had already made peace with it. She glanced around the apartment one last time, a mix of sadness and relief settling in her chest. This place had been a symbol of her relationship with Mark, but it was no longer hers. It was time to leave. She needed to find a new space, a place where she could rebuild, where she could heal. Sarah grabbed her coat and purse, walking toward the door. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, as though preparing herself for the world outside. She wasn't sure where she would go, but that didn't matter. She would figure it out. She had always figured things out. She had survived this, and she would survive whatever came next. As she stepped out into the night, Sarah felt the cool air on her face, and for the first time in a long while, she felt free. There was uncertainty ahead, yes, but she wasn't afraid. She had learned something profound in the last few hours. She had learned that she could walk away from the past, that she didn't need to cling to something that wasn't good for her anymore. She could make her own future. The streets were quiet, but in the stillness, Sarah heard the quiet whisper of hope. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in it. The days following Mark's departure were a blur, a haze of quiet moments that Sarah had never expected to experience. There were no dramatic confrontations, no final outbursts of anger. Instead, there was an unsettling calm as she adjusted to the life she had created for herself, one that was now without Mark. The apartment that had once felt like home now felt too large, too empty. The rooms echoed with silence, and it was in this silence that Sarah began to discover the quiet, strength within herself that had long been dormant. At first, she did everything she could to avoid the painful memories. She kept herself busy, work, errands, small tasks around the apartment. Anything to avoid facing the reality of her situation. There were days when the sadness would hit her out of nowhere, the ache in her chest reminding her of the loss she had endured. The tears would come, and she would let them, allowing herself the release she so desperately needed. But in the aftermath of the tears, there was a sense of clarity. The fog in her mind began to clear, and she could see things more clearly than she ever had before. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Sarah would find herself searching the old photos on her phone, looking at the smiling faces of herself and Mark from happier days. She would wonder, what went wrong? How did I miss the signs? But each time she felt herself falling into the trap of regret, she would stop, take a deep breath, and remind herself that this wasn't her fault. She wasn't the one who had betrayed trust. She wasn't the one who had chosen to hurt someone they loved. Slowly, Sarah started to rebuild. She started small. She began with the things that brought her comfort. Long walks in the park, reading books she had neglected, reconnecting with old friends. She started taking better care of herself, eating healthier, working out, and indulging in self-care routines that had once felt like luxuries. Each of these small actions gave her a sense of control, of power, over her own life. She had let Mark dictate her happiness for so long, but now it was her turn. One evening, while sitting in her favorite cafe, sipping on a hot cup of tea, Sarah took a deep breath and closed her eyes. It was a simple moment, but it was a moment of peace. She hadn't realized how much she had missed peace until now. The constant tension, the worry, the wondering what was happening behind her back, all of that was gone. And with its absence, a sense of freedom began to bloom within her. She was no longer shackled to the past. She was free to be herself again. That night, she made a decision. She would move, not just out of the apartment, but out of the life she had built with Mark. She needed a fresh start, a new environment to fully embrace the changes she had made within herself. The thought of moving to a new city, away from all the memories, filled her with excitement. She wasn't running away. She was stepping into her new life, a life that was hers and hers alone. It felt liberating. The next few weeks were spent sorting through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. She got rid of items that reminded her too much of Mark, his old shirts, the framed photos of their vacations, the little trinkets they had picked up together. At first, it felt difficult. She could feel the weight of those memories as she packed them away, but it didn't take long for the weight to lift. With each item she let go of, she felt a little lighter, a little freer. Finally, the day came, when she was ready to leave. Her car was packed with her belongings, and she stood in the doorway of the apartment one last time, looking out over the city. She felt a mixture of sadness and relief, but above all, she felt hopeful. She was no longer the woman who had been blindsided by betrayal. She was no longer the woman who clung to a relationship that wasn't meant to be. She was the woman who had walked away, who had chosen herself, and who was now ready to create a life that was entirely her own. As Sarah drove away, she couldn't help but smile. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility. She didn't know exactly what her future held, but for the first time in a long while she was excited to find out. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her. She wasn't waiting for a man to fill the emptiness inside her. She was whole. She was enough. And that was when she realized, truly realized, that the end of her relationship with Mark wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, a rebirth. She had walked away from the past, and in doing so, she had found herself again. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt peace. Peace with her past, peace with her decisions, and most importantly, peace with herself. The future, uncertain as it may be, was hers to create. And with that thought, she stepped into her new life, one that was full of hope, strength, and endless possibilities.